Welcome to this WiseOwl Excel VBA tutorial. In this part of our series on writing SQL for Excel files, we're going to introduce you to outer joins. So we're going to begin with a quick reminder of what an inner join does and what set of rows it returns, and explain why an inner join might not always be the most appropriate join type to use. We'll then use a left join to make sure that we always return all of the rows from one of the tables in your joins, and show you how to do the same thing using a right join instead. We'll explain how you can use joins to return only the unmatched rows from the two tables you're selecting from, and then look at how you can join multiple tables in the same query and control the order of the joins. So let's get started. If you've been following along with previous parts of this series, you'll be familiar enough with the basic setup by now, so feel free to skip to the next chapter of the video. If you haven't seen previous parts of the series, here's a quick look at the basic setup. We've got a macro-enabled workbook called outer joins, and this has got some code which allows us to run a query to extract data from a separate Excel file called movies. So when we click the Run Query button, we're going to pull some data from this movies workbook, which contains lots of different worksheets with information about films and related data. I'm going to keep the movies workbook open so I can point out various things as we work through the video, but feel free to close down movies and all the code will still work. I've got both these files stored in the same folder, and I'll drop a link in the video description so that you can download these yourself and follow along with writing the code if you'd like to. A lot of the code in the outer joins workbook relies on Microsoft ActiveX data objects. That's not something I'm going to talk about in this video. This playlist is all about the SQL side of things. But if you are interested in the ActiveX data object side, we have a separate playlist which covers that. I'd recommend starting with this video here, How Do I Get Data from a Closed Excel File Using VBA? And I'll drop a link in the description below to this playlist. Just to show you the basics of the code working, if I head back to the outer joins workbook, when I click the Run Query button, it's going to trigger a subroutine called Create SQL Query. And the only job of this subroutine is to construct the query that we're then going to pass into a separate subroutine which deals with all the complicated stuff, such as establishing the connection to the movies workbook, loading the record set full of data, and here's the point at which our query gets used to populate the source property of the record set, and then all of the other code deals with writing that information out into a new worksheet in the outer joins workbook. So just to give this a quick test, to select the title and release date from the film worksheet in the movies workbook, I can head back to the menu sheet, click the Run Query button, and I'll see my set of data outputted into a new sheet. The query that I've just executed has returned every row from the film sheet in the movies workbook, and we can just have a quick check to make sure we've returned the expected number of rows. If I head down to the bottom of the list in the output worksheet, I can see that excluding the column headers, I've returned 1,205 rows. If I head back to the movies workbook and look at the film sheet, head down to the bottom of that list, we can see the same number of rows listed there as well. I've also included some extra code in our query code which will print out the number of rows returned by the query each time we run it, and that's included in the Get Query Results subroutine. That's important because we're going to include an extra table in our select statement now. We're going to include the country table so that we can display the name of the country in which each film was made. Now, in order to do that, we're going to have to join the country sheet into the From clause. This is something we've done in the previous video in the series, so I'm just going to very quickly remind you of how this basic data is set up. In the film worksheet, we don't store the name of the country that a film was made in, we store the country ID. So, for example, for Jurassic Park, to work out which country that film was made in, I'd have to take the number 241, head over to the country worksheet, look up the number 241 in the country ID column, and then look along that row to return the name of the country. So we're going to use a basic inner join to do this. Just a quick reminder that I've got a diagram here which represents all of the relationships in this simplified database in our Excel workbook. So we can see that the country table has a relationship to the film table joined on the country ID columns. And again, we talked about that in more detail in the previous video in the series, so it's a useful one to refer back to if you want some more information about how this works. So let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor. And to include a new table in our From clause, let's concatenate the continuation character first of all. So we can write this on the next line. And then we're going to use an inner join to join the country table. And because country is a worksheet, I need to include the $ symbol at the end of that table name. I can then assign an alias to that table to make it easier to reference its columns, and then say what condition these two tables should be joined on. So I want to join country to film on the condition that the film country ID is equal to the country ID. Okay, so once I've done that, I can then include the country column in the select list. So let's add a new column to the select list. Let's say c.country. And concatenate the final continuation character. Head back to the menu sheet in the outer joins workbook and run that query again to return the films and release dates and country names. So the query has worked and returned the extra column that we wanted, but what's it done to the number of rows that we've returned? Well, let's have a quick look. If we head down to the bottom of the list on the new output sheet, we've suddenly got 2 fewer rows than we had last time, only 1,203 rows of data this time. The reason for that is that not every single film in the film table has been assigned a country ID. If we head back to the movies workbook, head to the film sheet, have a look in the country ID column. I'm just going to hold down the control key and tap the down arrow key to jump down to the cell immediately above the next blank one. We can see that there's a film here with no value in the country ID column. So when you use an inner join, the combination of rows that's returned is based on the condition that we've written. So we're only going to return rows where the country ID in the film table is equal to the country ID in the country table. And if a film has no country ID in the film table, it does not have a match in the country table. An alternative way to think about what's happening here is to think of the various tables involved in your joins as a set of overlapping circles, Venn diagrams. Here's a quick example of the inner join. If we think about the blue circle here on the left-hand side, representing every single row from the film table, we know there's 1,205 rows in that blue circle. The set of data in the orange circle represents every single one of the countries in the country table. And the overlapping part of those two circles, or the inner part of those two circles, is the combination of rows in the film table and the country table where there's a match in the country ID columns. So what we need to do if we wanted to get every row from the film table, regardless of whether it had a matching country, we need to get everything from the blue circle. To do that, we're going to write a left outer join. So the basic principle is the same, the basic pattern of the code is the same. It's just that this time the set of results we get will include every single row from the film table, the table on the left-hand side, regardless of whether it has a match in the country table. So to do this, let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor. Changing the code is remarkably simple. All I have to do is change the word inner. I can say either just left join, or if you wanted to expand on that, you can say left outer join. The word outer is completely optional here. There is no such thing as a left inner join. So the word outer here is a little redundant. But if you wanted to spell this out correctly, then left outer join rather than left join. Let's also add in an order by clause so we can clearly see that our results are being returned correctly. We'll see the 2 films with no country sitting at the top. So I'm going to include an order by clause to the end of the query and order in ascending order of c.country. Okay, so having done all of that, we can head back to the menu sheet and we can run our query one more time. And this time we will see the 2 additional films which have no matching country sitting at the top of the list. And we've got 1,205 results once again. And we should see that reflected in the immediate window, 1,205 rows. The name left outer join implies that there might also be something called a right outer join, and indeed there is. So let's have a look at what a right join can do for us in this example. Just having a quick look back at the movies workbook and the country worksheet. This worksheet contains a list of 203 countries of the world. But not every single one of those countries has films made in it in this film worksheet. So not every single one of the country IDs has been used in the country ID column of the film sheet. In Venn diagrams or overlapping circle terms, it means that if we're using either an inner join or a left join, we're not seeing a number of results from the country table. If we wanted to include the results from the country table, we can change the left join into a right join or a right outer join. So we'll get the inner portion of the results again, and then return all of the additional countries which do not have any films listed in the film sheet. And again, changing the query to do that is incredibly simple. Heading back to the Visual Basic Editor, all we would need to do is change the word left to the word right instead. So having done that, we can head back to the menu sheet, click the Run Query button again, and we'll get a list of all of the countries in the world this time, or at least all of the countries listed in the country worksheet in the movies workbook. Countries which do have films made in them may appear multiple times, once for each film made in that country. We'll have nothing, nulls, next to any country which does not have a film listed in the film sheet. Now, there's nothing particularly special to distinguish a left join from a right join. They both essentially do exactly the same thing. They're designed to return all of the rows from one of the two tables involved in your join. So we could achieve exactly the same results we've achieved here using a left join. And all we'd need to do in order to make that work is to list our tables in a different order. So the leftness or the rightness of a table is determined purely by the order in which you write the tables in your query. If I just temporarily put these onto a single continuous line, so we can see that I've physically written the film table on the left of the country table in this particular join. So if I want all of the rows from the table on the left of the join, then I say left join, that will give me everything from the film table. All of the rows from the table on the right, then use a right outer join, and that gives me everything from the country table. So all I'm going to do in this example, to get the exact same results using a left join, is I'm going to move the country table reference to the beginning, and then move the film table reference to after the join, and then change my join type to be a left outer join. The on condition doesn't need to be changed. We're asking if one thing is equal to another, so it doesn't matter which way round we test that, it will always do the same thing. So having done this, if we head back to the menu sheet again and run that query, we'll get exactly the same results using a left join as we just did using a right join instead. One thing you may have noticed about both left and right outer joins is they still include the inner portion of the overlapping circles. So I've asked for all of the results from the country table using a left outer join here, but I'm still seeing matching results from the film table. What if I wanted to do, for example, show only the countries in which no films have been included in this database, so all of the unmatched countries from the country table? In overlapping circle terms or Venn diagram terms, I basically want to eliminate this overlapping part of the circles. So I want to go from an outer join to one which excludes the inner portion. To do that, I can simply include a where clause in my query. If we have a look at the set of results we've just generated, any country which does not have a film made in it will have null in any column from the film table, so there's nothing there to be displayed. So if we ask for any of the film columns containing a null, that will return a list of only those countries with no films made in them. So that's relatively simple to do. Let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and we can include an extra where clause in our query. So let's say where, and then it doesn't really matter which column you choose to base this criterion on. I'm going to go with f.filmid, if I can spell film correctly. Eventually, there we go. Film ID is null. So I've deliberately not used columns that might potentially have nulls in them for any other reason. If I head back to the movies workbook and look at the film worksheet, there are several columns of data. For instance, the budget column and the box office column. These contain lots of nulls naturally because I didn't have any information to enter for those particular values. It's far less likely that the film ID will be null. Every film should have a corresponding unique identifier. So checking if the film ID is null, really the only reason that should be the case is if there is no film for the country we're trying to show the results for. So having done all of that, if we then head back to the menu sheet in the outer joins workbook, run the query again, and we've returned a list of only those countries which have no films. And we can happily now exclude the title and release date columns from our select list to tidy that up and select just the country name to show the unmatched countries. Next, I'd like to include another table in my query so that I can show the name of the studio which released the film. I'm just going to spend a bit of time tidying up the query first of all. I'm going to get rid of the where clause entirely. We'll bring that back a little later on. And then I'm going to reorganise my from clause as well. The focus of this query is films. I'm interested in showing a list of films with related information. When you're writing queries that involve multiple tables, you tend to start with the first main table that you're interested in. So the focus here is on films. I would like to start my query by referring to the film table. So I'm just going to reorganise the list of tables so that film appears first and so that country appears after the join. I'm also then going to take the left outer join portion down to the next line so that we can separate out each individual table that we're listing. And I'm showing the title, release date and country, ordered by country. And I'm just going to give that a quick check to make sure that we're still returning all 1205 results. So back in the menu sheet, I can run the query and I should find that I get those 1205 films as we did last time, and that should be reflected in the immediate window. So let's bring in the studio table next. To include or join another table in a query, if you watched the previous video, you'll remember that you have to enclose each set of individual joins in a set of round brackets. So I'm going to wrap up the part that's already working in a set of round brackets. We know that part's safe and sound. And then I'd like to bring in the studio table. Now we saw earlier on, didn't we, that we had some missing country IDs in the country table, in the film table, in the country ID column. We had some gaps in our list. For the studio table, however, or the studio ID column, there aren't any gaps in this list at all. So every single film has got a studio ID assigned to it. So let's try using an inner join for the studio table. If we head back to the Visual Basic Editor, at the end of that line we can include a new line which says inner join, and then in some square brackets, studio followed by a $sign because it's a worksheet, as S on f dot studio ID equals s dot studio ID. And then we can close the double quotes and concatenate a continuation character, and then in the select list include an extra column from the new table we've just joined. So we'll go for s.studio. Okay, so having done that, we should be able to head back to the menu sheet and click the Run Query button to return a new set of results, including the name of the studio which released each film. Now let's just check that we've returned the expected number of results. If we head down to the bottom of the list on the output sheet, we can see that we've actually missed a couple of rows again. We've only got 1,203 rows of data. And that's reflected in the immediate window. If we head back to the Visual Basic Editor, it says exactly that in the output there. And the problem again is because we're using an inner join, we're only returning rows where the film and studios have a matching value in the studio ID columns. So that tells us there must be some kind of mismatch between the columns we're joining on. To make sure that we always include all of the films, we can change the inner join once again to a left join or a left outer join. So that makes sure that we always get every single row from the table on the left-hand side of this join. Now the table on the left-hand side of the join is actually the combination of films and countries. Still, the principle is the same. So if we switch that to a left outer join, and let's just also modify the sort order again. Let's go for s.studio, and then head back to the menu sheet and run that query again. We'll be back with a couple of new films, this time sitting up at the top of the list with no matching studio. Just to check, if I switch down to the bottom of that list, we do indeed have the extra 2 rows, 1,205 now. And the reason that this is happening is because although there is a studio assigned to these 2 films, Hunt for the Wilder People and Boy, if I have a look on the film sheet in the movies workbook, head down to the bottom of that list, These two films are fairly close to the bottom. So these each have the studio ID 281 assigned to them. So there is a value there, but the problem is that that value 281 doesn't exist in the studio table. So I think that was the New Zealand Film Commission. If I wanted to make sure that I always included those films, or I found a match for them, I could include the number 281 here and the name of the new studio, but I'm not going to do that in this particular case. We can get all of the results from the film table by making sure that we use an outer join to always return everything from the table on the left. If we had a large number of films which had an invalid studio ID assigned to them, it could be useful to limit this list to only the films with an invalid studio ID. And we can use the same basic technique we looked at earlier on to find only the countries with no films. We could find the films with an invalid studio ID. So to do that, if we have a look at our set of outputs, if the film has an invalid studio ID, then any field in the studio table will contain a null. So we can simply add a where clause to our query again. Let's just do that quickly. Let's include a where clause. And then this time we will ask where the s dot either studio or studio ID. It doesn't really matter. They will both be null if the studio doesn't exist. Is null. And then we can concatenate that continuation character. So having done that, we can head back to the menu sheet. And this time we'll return only those films which have an invalid studio assigned to them, so it makes it a bit easier for us to find the invalid data to correct those problems. Just as last time, if we wanted to flip this query around so that instead of showing the films with no valid studio, we showed the studios with no films, we can either rearrange the list of tables in our from clause, or we could just change the type of join we're using. So let's say we're going to change this from a left join to a right join, and then we'll also want to make sure that we change our where clause to find any studios with no corresponding films. So I'm going to change my where clause to check for films or rows where the f.film ID is null. It doesn't really matter what sort or order I use for this example. If we head back to the menu sheet and run that query again, this time we'll see a list of all of the studios with no films made in them in the film sheet. So from this point on, whenever we want to include a new table in our query, the basic pattern we follow is essentially the same. Let's say we want to include the director table next so that we can show the name of each director next to their films. If we head back to the Visual Basic Editor, let's get rid of the from clause, beg your pardon, the where clause. I don't want to limit the number of results we're seeing. And I'm going to change the studio join back to a left outer join so that I can see all of the films from the film table. To include the director table, let's cheat a little bit. I'm going to copy and paste the join to the studio table. Then I'm going to wrap a set of round brackets around the original set of joins that we know already work. And then just for testing purposes, let's go with an inner join for the director table first. So I'll say inner join, director, I'm just going to copy the word director, as D on f.director ID equals d.director ID. And then in my select list, I can include any column from the director table. So let's say d.fullname. Okay, so having done that, if we head back to the menu sheet, we should just check if we run the query how many results we return. So again, we're going to have fewer than the expected 1,205, or maybe you have come to expect that we'll get fewer results when we use an inner join. An inner join may exclude results without you knowing about it. So using a left outer join will make sure that we always get all of the results from the film table, regardless of whether there is no director assigned to the film or whether we have an invalid director ID assigned to the film. Just to see which new films we've re-included, let's change the order by clause so we can see the film sorted in order of director's full name. And then, having done that, we've switched the join to a left join or a left outer join, and then head back to the menu sheet. If we can find it, we've got a few too many sheets now, let's just tidy things up. and then run the query again, and we get the additional 5 films that we were previously missing, and it appears that they don't have any director assigned to them. If we have a look back at the movies workbook and we can find that list of films, so that actually all the ones down at the bottom here, the last 5 in the list, they do actually have a director ID assigned to them. It's just that that director ID doesn't appear in the director table, so there is no match for that join to find. So there we go, there's the basics of working with left and right outer joins in queries. Hope you found that one useful. Thanks very much for watching, see you next time.